This is episode 215 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, we have a bit of breaking news, at least for the Facebook Live crowd, and it's still pretty breaking even if you tune into this podcast a day from now. A New Mexico judge has granted a temporary restraining order after the New Mexico Restaurant Association filed a lawsuit against Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham for imposing a ban on indoor dining. The restraining order gives restaurants 10 days of in-store, in the restaurant dining at 50% capacity while maintaining other COVID-safe practices. So this is big news and very important news, and I think very good news, although who knows what the result of the ultimate lawsuit will be. Before I get your 2 cents in here, the governor has issued a statement, first saying that she's appealing to the Supreme Court of New Mexico. And the thing that kills me here is that she says in her statement, a bad ruling by a judge doesn't change that she's trying to keep people safe, essentially. New Mexico's business operators should continue to abide by the state's guidelines and restrictions. Anything less is a risk to the health and safety of employees, customers, their communities, and indeed our entire state. The governor is incredibly grateful to the business owners who are complying and going above and beyond to protect health. So this will head up to the New Mexico Supreme Court, presumably for another virtual hearing on the issue. And boy, pretty tough stuff there from the governor's office. A bad ruling. She just calls them out. Very Trumpian, I might add.
Well, and it's interesting, Paul, that this filing happened 5 days ago, and it said in the order granting the temporary restraining order that the administration did not reply. So there was 5 days of crickets. So, I guess maybe that was their political calculus that we're not going to even talk to this district judge. We're just going to go straight to the Supreme Court. But I did find it interesting that there was no response. It wasn't like they had this restraining order is without merit, and here's the reasons why. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. None of that.
Well, there's obviously a lot of legal issues swirling around on the COVID-19 and the governor's response, and various judges have generally been pretty deferential to the governor. So this is, I think, the first I can recall judge to stick out their neck and say no to the governor and her orders. We'll see if it sticks after 10 days and the Supreme Court gets its hearing. But yeah, it's interesting times here.
Yes, and I believe this restraining order was filed under the arbitrary and capricious standard, which it's hard to not find. And again, not legally, but just from a common sense point of view, there does seem to be more than a little bit of arbitrariness with regard to what COVID policy is, who gets to stay, who gets to go, what the logic is, etc. And
especially when the governor herself did not cite any specific issues with restaurants spreading or the spread happening in restaurants. She didn't cite anything that they were specifically doing wrong in reordering the shutdown of indoor dining at the restaurants. She said along the lines of, the restaurants haven't done this to the people of New Mexico. The people of New Mexico have done this to the restaurants, and really putting the onus on us for allegedly not following through with everything that she's wanted us to do as people and the citizens of the state.
Yeah, and nothing's more fun as a human being as being punished for the actions of others. There's the proverbial whipping boy, as it were. So, I think that she didn't do herself any favors politically describing it the way she did, and then to not reply to a judge. Here's the thing. if you're called into court, no matter what, and you don't respond, you usually lose, and that's exactly what happened. So we'll see if she'll eventually come out on the other end. But in the meantime, the judge has granted this, and so like Puxatawny Field, 10 more days of indoor dining, I guess, is in the works. So
Yeah, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later. The New York Times has a very useful website dealing with COVID-19 and the situation in New Mexico and any other state you want to look at. But we had a little bump up, and it's one of those things you get day to day fluctuations. The peak of the death problem, in terms of deaths in New Mexico, the peak was on May the 15th, at least if you're looking at 7-day average, not individual day peak, but the 7-day average back on May 15th was 10 a day. So that was the rolling average peak in New Mexico. It's been declining ever since, whereas right now, the rolling 7-day average is 4. That's the latest data available as of July 19th. There were 2 deaths on Sunday. And, there was a little bump up mid-July, and now we seem to be back on a downward trajectory. We'll see if this happens. It's tough. When you get data, you see it moving in certain ways, and you wonder if it's a trend or not. But the fact is that the secondary bump seems to be back to a decline. And will that continue or not? We don't know. We know that other states are having more significant outbreaks in terms of cases, Texas and Arizona to name 2. The death rate has not been the same in those states as it was, say, in New York earlier in the year, or just earlier in the whole COVID-19 situation. So there's a lot of fluidity here, but with seemingly the situation moving in the right direction, at least in terms of the death rate situation in New Mexico, maybe the judge is going to say, look, we've gone far enough with regard to shutting down restaurants. It's time to start reopening. Or the judge is, I should say, the Supreme Court. But there's no way to tell in these things. I was very disappointed with the court, and especially Judge Nakamura, for saying that it was okay for the legislature to move forward in kind of the slightly off the radar. The legislative session, the special session, was a little opaque, if you will. It wasn't completely open, certainly. It was not completely closed because they did have a lot of things online. But watching proceedings in the legislature online is not the same as watching them in person and going up to the roundhouse. And so maybe the court will redeem itself. And I'm not even sure if Nakamura will be up there, because I know Justice Vigil was recently added to the court, and I suppose that he's going to be the he's taking over for Nakamura, as opposed to Nakamura being on the court. But I'm a little confused at that whole process. I didn't think Nakamura was quite leaving the court that quickly.
Well, one thing about the New Mexico Supreme Court is that if you take a strict interpretation of the law, you will be frequently disappointed in the ruling. So enough said. That's all I have to say about that.
No, I hear you.
This is a little bit uncharted territory. This health order thing, and what's legal, what isn't. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see, one, how quickly they take it up, and then 2, what they decide.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll get back to a little bit of the science soon, but I think it's safe to say that with back to school right around the corner, that is the issue looming in many ways regarding COVID-19. APS and other districts have released back to school plans. APS is going to be completely virtual through Labor Day, after which they plan on going to the hybrid model. Other districts are doing more or less similar things because these are the regulations put forth by the public education department. But I want to elaborate a little bit on this. I'm writing an op-ed for the Las Cruces Sun News and other newspapers across the state. my family is going to homeschool. We've alluded to it, we've talked about it, but it's really hitting home now because I'm in the midst of cleaning out an office space that was previously used by the foundation. Now it is going to be the Guessing Family Homeschool. And there's a lot of
The Guessing Academy.
yes, the Guessing Academy. You can guess on those tests all the time. Just get them right. But
Where guessing is encouraged
Exactly.
at the Guessing Academy. Okay,
Yes.
enough of that.
oh, we can go on for days. But it is something that my family has the ability to do, and it is something that while we never thought much of homeschooling, it's something that any red-blooded libertarian leaning person kind of looks at and considers at a given point, especially in a state like New Mexico where the schools are not known for being the highest achieving schools in the country, to say the least. But we also considered charter schools and private schools and other options. And especially given the COVID-19 situation, we were really looking for potential private school options. But suffice it to say, nothing really caught our fancy, nothing really made sense. And we question what is going to happen in a lot of these private and charter schools as well, given the strict orders coming down from the state. The challenge I think we're dealing with here is people who don't have the flexibility in their schedules, don't have the resources available to do this kind of learning at home. Where are they going to be? Kids are already 2.5 months behind from losing that time at the end of last year. New Mexico, we know, is not a high performing state, and it just seems very frustrating, sad, odd that more in the kind of so-called education establishment, which tends to be on the left, are not pushing back against what is at best a bare representation of traditional public schools. And yet we're just moving forward under the auspices of this kind of very odd new system that I think is not going to be a good option for a majority of New Mexico children, because teachers aren't used to it. They're not used to it. In best case scenario, when they're in the classroom, learning with a mask on, learning with a teacher with a mask on, socially distanced from their friends and other kids, it's going to be a really difficult model at best for everybody in terms of learning.
Yeah, and we've talked in previous shows about first and second grade distance learning using computers. That may even be a little more challenging, although I would put up any fifth, sixth, or seventh graders. Sometimes there's some rambunctiousness there. There's whole issues. If you're academically oriented and have the attention span to do that, I think it might work out fine. But in a lot of cases, for a lot of kids, I think there will be huge, huge challenges. And then just a little more about your point relative to homeschooling. Yes, if you're a two-parent household, and the flexibility that might bring with regard to the ability to have the time to do homeschooling, that's the one thing. But the other is depending on the age and the requirements of your kids, it's a lot to ask of even most two-parent households to have the skills necessary to, for example, lead someone through, middle school and high school mathematics, for example. That's one of those things that, heck, the public schools have a hard time getting qualified teachers that have a good background in that subject, much less sciences, engineering, and some of the other things that are at least touched upon in high school. So it is an interesting thing. And, as you said, New Mexico hasn't been doing that well on our academic achievement anyway. Maybe we won't go down relative to other places if they're all going down, but we were not starting off in a real sweet spot anyway across much of our state.
Yeah, and I write in this op-ed, which will be sent out to media outlets this week. It's it's challenging enough for somebody who's educated and has the resources. But if you're a single parent who doesn't have a lot of educational training at a high level, uh, you're really going to be behind the eight ball here. You're going to be in the toughest challenge of anybody. And for kind of this whole educational establishment just to not discuss this in a public way. Now, if Susana Martinez were doing this kind of thing and Hannah Scandera, I can imagine that there would be a much more forceful response and many more alternatives thrown out there. But it just seems like, again, it's all political. If And I'm not saying that's easy for school districts and for family, certainly families, but school districts to come up with innovative solutions and PED and whatnot. But I just have to think that there would be more pushback, more concern expressed publicly about the neediest children in our state if this situation were being handled by, say, a Republican governor. It just seems that there's been limited to no discussion coming from the social justice groups in New Mexico.
Yeah, without a doubt. And even those, many of those groups, they tend to focus on the dollar amount of funding, not on the academic achievement and the outcomes of education,
That's
which at the end of the day, that is what education is about. That's what it's for. And it is these are trying times that will be trying economically. They will continue to be trying on the health front. And then on the education front, when having an education, is such a high correlation, even a good high school solid education for meaningful work, meaningful employment, and success in the workplace. There's a whole lot of problems being thrown into that system that didn't need them, at least in New Mexico. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, keeping with the education theme, we are going to play a brief interview. Channel 13 ran KRQE with David Scrace, and he is the main health advisor to Governor Lujan Grisham. And he has some very telling and I think concerning words to say. It's available at errorsofenchantment.com if you want to go back and find this video. But Wally, you can get the
Yeah, so the point of that is this is another indirect effect, right? So we want to keep kids out of school so their parents don't go and run amok. Is that what I heard?
that is what
I mean, is that what he said?
that is what he said. And I think Mr. Scrace is an educated man. He's done enough media, certainly over the last 4 months, that he would know what his words seem to mean. And, I can't say anything except that he is saying what he actually believes, which is that it's not the kids in the classrooms that are likely to spread the COVID-19 from person to person. It is having the parents free to go earn a living or go shopping or doing whatever they need to do, as opposed to staying home and kind of supervising their kids. That is his concern with regard to spreading the virus. And I think the thing that really bothers me about this is not the two-faced approach that I see from the governor and her administration, including Mr. Scrace. I think what really hits home for me is how profoundly this whole COVID-19 situation is affecting children. Of course, we've talked about it, the 11-year-old boy down in Hobbs who took the extreme action, very sad action of committing suicide. Now, that is not going to happen to every child. Certainly, it's something that hopefully will be very rare and isolated. But for any part of this shutdown to be motivated and keeping kids at home to be motivated by anything but the actual importance and life-saving aspect of social distancing and people wearing masks and the whole 9 yards is the height of malpractice. And it really does not look good for him, because it is the future of these kids that really matters. Not just being back in school, but being able to socialize with their friends. Some of them who are in terrible home situations, getting back to being in front of teachers and other adults who can call out or bring in aspects of the child welfare services to counteract or bring to light child abuse and those kinds of situations. We know that's a huge problem in New Mexico. It really is appalling, and I could say more, but I will refrain, that Mr. Scrace even put this out there. But it just shows you, I think, the arrogant attitude of these people.
Yeah, and it is very interesting that he talked about an indirect effect. So fine, but everything's COVID directly. So we know COVID is not a good thing. No one disagrees with that. But we also know that the impacts are just piling up economically in terms of the short term, long term, and maybe, whole generations to be damaged by the impacts of this. And so obviously they can understand indirect effects or secondary effects. Maybe they will take a look at this in terms of what the effect really is on these families and especially on these children, as you say.
Yeah, just very disheartening as the parent of 3 young children who, again, two parents in our family. We both got college degrees. We both got access to social networks and friends and even grandparents who can help out. And, plus we're kind of in the way of being a little civilly disobedient at times with regard to the powers that be and giving our children opportunities to do things, whether that's traveling out of state or something as simple as playing on the local playgrounds, at least when the weather wasn't so darn hot. So for other kids, I just really feel for them around our state. And David Scrace does not seem very concerned about their future, which we know, kids count report, we're not at a good level. Again, they're not even, this will not register in that report. All reports have their challenges, their pluses and minuses, but if you don't include something as a variable in a report, it is likely not going to make an impact on that. And while Kids Count, I think, is overall a good report, the COVID-19 situation and its long-term impacts on children in New Mexico and across the country, we won't know this until we actually have real academic experts go in and study cohorts of these children. It just won't show up in other reports that have been done for years, like Kids Count.
Yeah, and then if it turns out how many of these things do, I've read a lot of education reports in my day. When I was in Leadership New Mexico, I got some very interesting perspectives, and the thought that came to mind based on those is, when there's challenges, health challenges or whatever, some of the better students, if they miss a lot of school, but they're very good students, they have a supportive learning environment, they tend to come back from that. But it's the below average students that sometimes they'll get in a situation for whatever reason, a sick parent, they have an illness, they move around a lot. They get off in a very bad place, and a lot of them never come back and succeed to the point where these are, sometimes these things happening to 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders are the 8th and 9th grade dropout kids just a few years down the line.
And now we get to go down a similar related topic. Again, kind of this is an education theme for the podcast. Our old buddy, Representative Javier Martinez, who if he does one service for this world, it is providing great copy and talking points for this podcast, because, man, he is out there. Unfortunately, he's elected. He is not just elected, he's the chairman of the House Tax Committee. He's also, I think, if you want to point to the mentality of somebody that is really part of the problem in the state of New Mexico, one of the reasons that we're where we are in so many categories at 50th or whatever, 51st, and sometimes 49th. Javier Martinez's column from the Albuquerque Journal is an indicator of his attitudes and the way he thinks about things that's really profoundly disturbing. The headline, of course, is Protecting Permanent Fund Protects Systemic Racism. Whew. Now, that alone,
Okay, I know what it means. I'm just trying to think. Does he say how it does that? Or did he just say that it does?
He doesn't really explain how, so to speak. I mean, he has said these kinds of things before. In fact, a couple years ago, he called out Senator John Arthur Smith and essentially called him racist for not wanting to tap into the permanent fund at a higher rate to spend more money for his pre-K programs. Now, Javier Martinez takes it as a point of irreconcilable, irrefutable fact that pre-K will have great impacts on low-income and poor New Mexico students. So again, this gets into the where are you, Mr. Martinez, Representative Martinez, on restarting our schools, helping out poor, needy, low-income, minority kids, getting them back into classrooms with this COVID-19 situation, as opposed to just arguing more money coming out of the land grant permanent fund. He says, children of color continue to experience some of the worst child well-being outcomes in the country. The system has failed them. Too many will end up as another statistic of children who perform poorly in school, are forced into the criminal justice system, and develop drug use disorders. He doesn't talk anything about the importance of two-parent families, the importance of gainful employment and a strong economy, the justice system itself, which he does actually work on a lot, but drug use disorders, are there no personal choices being made here by people and their families? So, and he talks about the cycle of poverty. So here's where he talks about the issue of the permanent fund. He says that New Mexico was, quote, too Mexican, incapable of self-government, and not to be trusted with the land and resources. This is the genesis of the creation of the Land Grant Permanent Fund that he wants to get at. $19 billion is where he puts the value of that. Now, do you know, Wally, New Mexico is not the only state that has a permanent fund. I'm sure you're aware, right?
Yeah, Alaska has one, as I recall.
Yes.
Is that are those?
There are, I tallied 8
Okay.
of them.
Yeah.
And actually put this into a blog post over at errorsoфenchantment.com. And you can go and read a little bit about the various states that have permanent funds. So he's saying that because New Mexico was a more minority-oriented state, that we didn't have, that the Congress at the time, the Progressive Congress around 1912, which was very much the progressive era, just a quick aside there, that they did not trust New Mexico because it was too Mexican, as Javier says. But there are numerous other states in the United States with permanent funds. Of course, Texas has a very big one. Alaska's is the second largest, and Texas is at $55.2 billion. This is from Wikipedia, so it's a little out of date, but 52.7 for Alaska, which is really huge because their population is less than ours. We have the third biggest at $20.2 billion, then Wyoming, North Dakota, Alabama, Utah, Oregon, Louisiana, and Montana. Now,
and it all tends to be from oil and gas,
from minerals,
minerals, right?
Exactly. Now, New Mexico is, known as a state that's had a long, proud Hispanic tradition, lots of large Hispanic population, but Alaska, not so much. Wyoming, North Dakota, definitely not Alabama either. My point in saying this is that it's not about racism, and that's not why we have a permanent fund in the state of New Mexico. We have a permanent fund because the mindset at the times was that oil and gas are scarce resources. They will go away. We want to, quote, put aside and invest the dollars from this one-time severance tax, literally taking something apart. If you sever your arm,
Right. It's gone.
it's gone.
If you don't sew it back on.
Yeah. So we did a whole podcast going into permanent funds and their, some of the faulty logic about them. But to say that it's a creation due to racism, it just defies historical reality and the fact that these other states, including Alaska, which of course provides annual checks to people who live in Alaska that get bigger as you stay in the state for a longer period of time. So, Wally, I want to give you an opportunity to throw some input in here.
Well, and I always come back to the thought experiment. I do this with a lot of people is let's imagine what would happen if we got rid of our permanent funds just as quickly as we possibly could. 20 billion is a lot of money, but believe me, the state budget is in the $6, 7, $8 billion. That's 3 years of state spending in New Mexico. Well, what could we do with that? What would 20 billion do? We could give it back to our people. Have basically the equivalent of the COVID payment that came from the federal government somewhere along those lines for every man, woman, and child.
Except for it wouldn't involve debt from the Chinese. It would actually be money we have.
Yeah, it would be money we have. But, then what would we say then? It's like, okay, what would that do to New Mexico? Well, that would make to keep the spending at the same level, we would need more immediate taxes. So we're going to have to raise something, income tax, property tax, gross receipts tax, all of which are relatively high. Property is a little bit lower, but man, our gross receipts tax, that is both the loud and proud and silent tax. It kind of hits on both accounts. So, these sovereign funds are not a guarantee, but it does provide some benefits. But I think the key is back to what we talked about with regard to education is what you spend that money on, is that the highest and best use for what you're trying to accomplish from a policy point of view? And man, her first name escapes me. Catherine Stevens talked about it's not whether something does some good, shouldn't be the tax investment or what we spend our tax money on. Is it doing the most good for what we want to accomplish? So it's one of those things. It doesn't take a lot of effort to get some good out of spending hundreds of millions of dollars. So even if we were to get early childhood education exactly how it's being proposed right now, would that do some good? And the answer is probably would. I would be willing to agree that it probably would do some good. Are there other things that would do more good? And the answer to that is, in all likelihood, yes. So it's not whether it does good, what can do the most good and most effective, what we're trying to do, particularly, and again, the theme comes back again and again because we're talking education, for our children. And you always hear it's for the children. Anyone who's been around Santa Fe knows that when those terms are uttered in a committee meeting or on the floor of the House or Senate, usually the person saying it is not for the children. It's just this blatant political attempt to do something, and they don't have any logical reasons why that's the best thing to do. And so it's kind of like in saying when the Miss America participants say world peace, you have to say that in your speech, you go forward. So this whole thing about for the children, it's frustrating, and it's not what we're doing, and what we've been doing in New Mexico hasn't been working for a lot of the children. And I'm not sure what spending more of the permanent fund without a plan, without any indication that it's going to work.
Yeah, and it is money right now that is going to fund the K-12 education system. It is money that's also going to the higher education system. Javier Martinez wants it to create a more robust, more universal plan for pre-K and early childhood money funding. And of course, we've already been doing that, as we discussed last week. The money allocated to early childhood has grown. I believe it doubled within a decade, and it continues to be a top priority of both parties. At least when Susana Martinez was in office, she certainly made it a priority in very difficult budget times. Michelle Lujan Grisham has made it a priority. But it's, making and Martinez this is something he excels at. He takes a policy issue and turns it into a race issue. And so here's a couple of paragraphs that he writes. The policy decisions made by politicians who are oblivious to race. I don't know any of them who are there up in Santa Fe, but sure, racism and racial power can inadvertently result in the upholding of racist systems of oppression. Past policy decisions to protect the LGPF, Land Grant Permanent Fund, from New Mexico's most vulnerable children are gross and obvious examples of institutional racism. Now, again, there is no policy in New Mexico to keep money away from these low-income children. In fact, the way the funding formula works is schools with higher proportions of lower-income kids get more money. Presumably, some of that at least filters into the Land Grant Permanent Fund, giving them somewhat more money. But the fact is that the money is used for those beneficiaries. Whether it's used effectively or not, that is certainly something that we could discuss and certainly debate with Mr. Martinez. Those same politicians, I'm continuing with his piece, claim we need to protect the fund for future generations. That claim is preposterous. The fact is that future never arrives. Well, it arrives every single year.
Every single second, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, and we'll be always sacrificing today's real children for the fictional kids of tomorrow, and then congratulate ourselves for having one of the largest permanent funds in the world and remain blind to the tragic conditions facing our children. Now, again, as Catherine Stevens pointed out, as we pointed out last week, just because you say you want to spend all this money doesn't mean your program is going to be A, effective, just period, or B, that it is the best possible use of the money. I could very easily create an alternative scenario where we eliminate New Mexico's personal income tax and or reform our gross receipts tax. And I believe that after 5 to 6 to 8 years, we will have New Mexico's economy in a position that long-term has more positive impacts for New Mexico's children than anything Mr. Martinez wants to do. But he refuses to even consider alternatives and is all too eager to dub a racist. So it's very frustrating. It's almost, it wouldn't be worth debating somebody who had this rhetoric if they were just at Voices for Children at something. But he is, like I said, a very powerful state representative who has some very, I think, unfortunate and wrong-headed views about some very important issues. And if you speak out against him, be prepared to be labeled a racist.
All right.
Well, interestingly enough, Rio Grande Foundation tracks per pupil spending data from the Census Bureau. And in the latest iteration of this report released back in April, I didn't find it. COVID-19 was going crazy, especially at that time, and was focused on that. But the U.S. Census Bureau found that per pupil spending by state, and I don't think this is complete, all the money that goes into it, but it's the Census Bureau's report, and they consistently report this data across state lines. Colorado led the way. New Mexico's traditionally been the number one spending state here locally. $10,202 from the state of Colorado per pupil. Texas, $9,606, those crazy radical Republicans over there. New Mexico, just below Texas, $9,582. Oklahoma, 8239, $8,239 per pupil. Arizona at 8239 also, and then Utah, which actually performs the best of almost any state in the country, $7,628 per student. So it's kind of interesting that New Mexico's no longer leading the way on a regional basis in terms of per pupil spending. I don't know if this is a trend in the making or a mere blip in the data. Certainly, Governor Lujan Grisham has been putting a lot of money into K-12, but Arizona, they had all those protests a few years ago. I believe Oklahoma had some as well. Political pressure has been building in some of our neighboring states, which have traditionally outperformed us in K-12, that they are spending more money. We'll see what, if any, results New Mexico or its neighboring states achieve with this money. Rio Grande Foundation, I created a explainer video at heirsofenchantment.com. We're now moving out of education directly into a more general COVID-19 related group of topics. And, I think it's incredibly relevant here as we have these controversies now about restaurants and now a judge reopening them, indoor dining at 50%. I went through and explained what we're looking at in terms of counties in our state that have not been subject to much, if any, problem with COVID-19. You've got Hidalgo, Grant, Sierra, Lincoln, Guadalupe, San Miguel, Union, Mora, and Lee County, as well as Los Alamos County, a total of 11 counties that have zero COVID-19 deaths. And I've used the New York Times website, again, that I mentioned earlier, to really dive into some of this data. I think it's a really good website. I can't give the entire URL, but it's they've got state by state, national COVID-19 kind of database and charts and all these kinds of things. It's quite stunning that 1/3 of New Mexico's counties, including Lincoln County is another one, that have significant populations within our state have zero COVID-19 deaths, and that they remain stuck within the same policy structure as the rest of our state.
Yes, and we've talked a lot. New Mexico is a very large geographic and very diverse state, and if there is a fundamental approach that is problematic, it's treating the entire state uniformly when it comes to dealing with this. So,
yeah, and there's a whole another group of counties in our state that have single-digit death totals per 100,000 population. I mean, each death is tragic. It's very sad, but the fact is that 2 deaths, as we see in Santa Fe County, per 100,000 is, there's traffic crashes that happen in a single night that take more lives, and those are tragic, but we don't stop driving our vehicles. Curry County has 2 per 100,000. Rio Arriba has 3 per 100,000. Valencia, 3. Taos County, 3. Eddy County, 3. Roosevelt County, 5. Doña Ana County, 6. Chavez County, 6. Torrance, 6. Colfax County, 8. So there are a lot of counties that have either 0 deaths or single digit per 100,000 death rates from COVID-19. And I think to have every single county treated just the same by our governor is very confusing and troubling.
yeah, without a doubt, the whole reason all of these procedures were put in place initially to flatten the curve. And when we talk about what the curve is, there's 2 curves actually. There's numbers of infections, and then there's the death rate and the strain on hospitals for people that are hospitalized. So certainly the latter has been flattened. So there's a uptick in cases, but the deaths are still incredibly low for, I'm sure, lots of reasons that I'm sure the science and data can tell us, but the bottom line is the curve has been flattened, but we don't always act like that in New Mexico.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how these data evolve and shift over time. We're still in the midst of this crisis. I think some countries, some states, we're going to see things shake out in the wash. We're not seeing that yet. I certainly hope that New Mexico's peak COVID-19 death situation is behind us and that we can start getting back to normal. I'm confident that other states are, going to see the same thing eventually. I just, at some point, we need to balance the economy and people's livelihoods and freedoms with squashing this virus. And New Mexico's definitely focused on one aspect of that, leaving most other aspects kind of behind. And at some point we're going to change, and maybe the courts will make that decision for the governor here very soon.
And I've seen some data that like a third of households have missed a rent or house payment in the last few months. When we look at the stress that's being placed on people, it's never good to do that. So once you're in that situation, you are getting close to the end of the rope economically.
We're at the end of the month. It's worth noting that the federal program providing the additional $600 in unemployment benefits expires, and it doesn't look like Congress will get to act to implement something before that expires. We shall see. A lot of free market people, including myself, have not thought that was a particularly good program, but there's going to be a lot of contention, a lot of debate over another bailout, another stimulus package, whatever you want to call it, as well as the unemployment program, and trying to continue something along those lines. I think it would be wise not to revisit that, to renew that, but that is what Congress is going to be looking at. So much going on, folks. Thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.